All right, man. Welcome to the Collin a Man's Answers show. This is episode 56. So thank you for being here. Just go ahead to start, introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, things like that.
Okay, I'm Payne. I am a local teacher historian from the Metro Phoenix area in Arizona. I'm a former vet. I'm half American, half Bahamian. My mom, she's from the Bahamas, and I spent a lot of my childhood in the Bahamas. I run I guess you could call it a blog on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, where I discuss historical topics. I've been doing it seriously since 2017. I started in 2016, but it was just sort of like random one-off topics. I would just pick in a historical figure or event that interested me. And then in 2017, I got really serious about it. And I started to just do full-on courses. I did a full course on US history, on world history, um, recently completed a course on the history of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, and right now I am wrapping up the first leg of what is going to be a very long and, for me, exhaustive history on ancient Rome. I'm going, and it's very audacious. I'm actually pretty proud of it. I'm going from the founding. We estimate that ancient Rome, that the first um, settlement, the first actual human interactions around what will become the city of Rome began around 10,000 years ago. Um, and I'm going from, well, not 10,000, roughly 10,000 years ago. I'm going from that point up to 1454 when the city of Constantinople fell. So it's a very long history, it's a very broad history, and kind of controversial because most people don't call the fall of Constantinople the Byzantine Empire. They don't count that in with the history of Rome, but at least for me, because the Eastern emperors did still exert influence after the fall of the West on the people living in the West, especially the Catholic Church, I'm including it. An interesting fact that most people don't know, or and some historians don't like to acknowledge, is that up until the rise of the Frankish kingdom, the popes in Rome had to be they had to be approved of by the emperors in Constantinople. That was sort of the reasoning for allowing Charlemagne to be called the Holy Roman Emperor of the German nation, just so the popes could have some protector against the encroachments on their authority from the emperors in Constantinople.
Hey, so, man, just real quick.
Okay, so Constantinople, the emperors in Constantinople, they actually exerted great influence on the former Western provinces after the barbarian tribes carved up the Western provinces into what would become the nascent kingdoms of England, France, Germany, and Spain. The popes, the Catholic Church as an institution, they were still pretty much under the thumb of the emperors in Constantinople, and a lot of people it has a lot to do with just cultural spheres, but a lot of people don't like to include the history of the Eastern Roman Empire after the reign of the Emperor Justinian in with Roman history. So it's a bit controversial in that respect to keep the history of Rome going until the fall of Constantinople. But uh, I, I've always viewed it as just being one long shot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the city of Rome itself, um, with Constantine the Great's move to Constantinople, the city of Rome itself pretty much lost its influence on the empire. The emperors in the West, as a matter of fact, when the Western Empire did finally fall, they weren't even in residence in Rome. They were actually living in Ravenna, the city of Ravenna in Italy. The city was completely abandoned. A few senators made the city home, but all the military elite, the economic elite, and the political elite, they were all living in Ravenna. So, so uh, it's a wrong, rambling historian's answer for it, but I'm including everything: the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire.
Dude, I am so fascinated by history. One, really, really, really fascinated with just the world history in general, but two main particular. I'm a politics and government and philosophy minor, so I'm really interested in like U.S. history, and what I'm writing my thesis on is actually the how the Marxist doctrine played an influence of the degeneration of the Soviet Union, and whether or not it was the influences and innovations of Lenin and Stalin that created the Soviet Union and the corruption and the atrocities, or if it was inherent in the Marxist doctrine. So that's what I'm writing my thesis on. But yeah, dude, what you're talking about and how you're just going through it, history fascinates me. How did you get into history? Was it always something that fascinated you? Was it something after you said you were a vet? Did you find it while you were serving your time? How did you get into this fascination of history and becoming a historian and teaching that?
I would say I was always fascinated with history. You know, the stories of the past. Always, it was always my favorite subject in school. It was always something that I would gravitate towards. I would always, pick up a book on the history of a nation or a good biography before anything else. Um, I've always gravitated toward it. I was always fascinated with the reasons and the explanations for the rise to greatness.
Yeah, man, history is fascinating because it's kind of like it not that it like it is what humans are, but it kind of describes what a human being is through the past, through what old societies did, how we became sophisticated. What is your favorite time period topic to study? I know you're studying ancient Rome right now. Is it all fascinating? But is there a specific time period that you're just fascinated with?
Oh, it is definitely ancient history, definitely antiquity. I think that we we sort of brush it off as just things that happened long ago and it doesn't really have much influence on our lives. But literally everything that we do is a reflection of what those people did. And I mean, even with the literature, talking about just what history means and what our society, our civilizations mean. I don't know if you ever read uh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? But the Epic of Gilgamesh comes across as just being a tale, just a written story, but there's a deeper philosophical message to it. Gilgamesh goes through life, and this Gilgamesh, he's a pretty famous guy already within his city, but he goes out. He has these wonderful adventures. He battles a wild man, becomes Enkidu. He becomes good friends with Enkidu. Enkidu died from a wasting illness, and he goes on this epic mission to try to find something to bring Enkidu back in. He fails in the mission. He's walking back to his city. By this time, an old man, and he's thinking about all the adventures he had and how no one is going to remember him and what his personal legacy is going to be, what the legacy of his people is going to be. And as he's walking, the city looms far off in the distance. It looms at this little speck, and as he completes the journey, as he gets closer to home, the city appears. He sees the walls, he sees the people, he sees the marketplaces. He's struck by the awe that his legacy and that the legacy of his society is his city. And it still strikes us because whenever you look at archaeological ruins and so forth, I'm always struck by just how similar everything is. It's not like you go to a ruin and you think this is pretty alien. You go to ruins and you see homes, you see public spaces, you see these great monuments that these people created to attest a moment in time. It's like 2,000 years from now, somebody stumbling across a city like New York or Chicago, they would be struck by the skyscrapers. The skyscraper will sort of be like the pyramids. You go to Egypt and you see the pyramids, and you wonder how these people could simply muster their energies and so forth to create a structure. You go to the Colosseum, you go to the Flavian Amphitheater, and you're struck by this concrete building that is still standing the test of time. You can still, the Italian government would never allow it, but you can still go there and put on the public games and the spectacles that Roman emperors did at the Flavian Amphitheater. It is still standing. You go to what's the site? What's the site? It's escaping me. It's Damn. Okay, well, I just lost my train of
No,
thought.
you're.
But I'll pick it up with something else. Hammurabi's Law Code,
Mm,
right? It's this amazing document, right? And it's more than just carved stela. It goes in depth into contract law. You know, the Babylonians are describing concepts that we still hold true to this day. You know, if you build a house, you just can't throw together any structure. You know, you have to make sure that it's sound and it's safe for habitation. Now, the Code of Hammurabi is very draconian in that, you know, if you build a house and the house collapses and kills somebody, they're going to kill someone in your family. You have to balance things out. But,
mm,
you know, nowadays we'll simply give you a fine, maybe a prison sentence. But the effect of the law is still there, to where if you're going to create a house or if you're going to enter into a contract with somebody, you have to make sure that it's sound. You have to make sure that it is habitable. You have to make sure that you're paying people decent wages. You have to make sure that you are not just putting flimsy products out there for people to buy. There are going to be consequences for your actions in our society. You know,
definitely.
it's that great legacy, but it's definitely ancient history. It's awesome.
Well, one thing about ancient history too is at some point, you know, that we have been, I don't know, they think we've been a species for hundreds of thousands of years, like the modern human. And then some can go back to like a million, almost, to like almost a kind of when we first started as a Homo sapien. But at some point, we began to write, and that's kind of the takeoff of the study of history and the study
Oh yeah.
of before and learning off is when we got that ability to write. And you know, there was hieroglyphics and things like that, but that ability to document what was happening, I think that was one of the most influential points of history. Do you agree? Do you think that when we started to write, that's when we really started to understand what was happening in the past and learning from it?
Oh yeah, and it goes beyond even just writing. I mean, writing was great. Writing is great because writing tells us what the elites were thinking, at least, and what the heads of the society wanted to pass down. You think of and it's funny. Most of us believe that writing came about simply as a way for accountants to keep track of economic progress and temples to keep track of donations to the temples. The first wars were not over territory or even dominating other people, but the first war sprang about over trade routes. You know, again, we're
Yeah.
going back to this accounting for what we're exchanging, what we're gaining, and what the temples are receiving. But you go beyond writing and you go back to cave paintings. You know, from cave paintings, we found that animals that we never would have associated with different regions lived there. You know, you look at cave paintings in France or North Africa, and you will see cheetahs and elephants and gazelle. And you know, now North Africa is mostly a desert, so it's a harsh, well, not even, I wouldn't say a harsh, but it's a stark reminder of how things change and what our forebears, the environment that they lived in. You know, the cave paintings in France, you see tigers and lions, you see, like, you know, archaic animals like that who lived there, and you see the people hunting them and so forth. So it's amazing to see that progression. Again, we're going back to this long arc of humanity, and you know, just the indomitable spirit of human societies to adapt to their local surroundings. And again, you know, even more contemporary, for a long time most people thought that the Vikings, the Scandinavians, never made it to North America. And then lo and behold, we find not just Viking towns, a Viking town at Leon Meadow, but we also find writings. You know, we find rune stones
Where
there.
is that city, Leon?
That oh, it's not even. It's a small. It was not a small village, but it was a village, but it's in Canada.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah, they made it. They made it all the way there. And writing is, and, you know, this is sort of like the the I guess the fall off with writing and with ruins is that they can tell us the people were there, but they can't tell us really what they were thinking and why they left. So at Leon Meadow, there's no signs of destruction, but
Mm.
the site was abandoned, and we don't know why it was abandoned. You know, the local native peoples of the area, they have no
oral traditions of Scandinavians making it there. There's no there's no like burning. There's no burn marks on any of the buildings, and there's no like rune stone or anything like that saying why they left. You know?
Yeah. I think you brought up something important too. We don't know what they were thinking. You know, to go on, I'm like I said, I'm a philosophy minor, but to go into a little bit of philosophy, you know, I think another one of the most important points in history was Immanuel Kant, and I'm pretty sure it's Immanuel Kant, and I think therefore I am. You know, realizing that we are these beings that are conscious, and that distinguishes us between, you know, the other species that are on planet Earth. I think it is fascinating that you can look back and see ruins and things like that, and we have this almost bias to think that they were just like us. You know, they did think, they did love, they did come together as a society. We are a societal animal, a societal breed. And so I think we do have this almost personistic bias to look at the past and say those people were like us, but we'll never know exactly if they were, or if they were conscious, or if they were exactly like us, you know?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And again, this is an area where writing fills in some of the blanks, but it also leaves us wanting more. So with ancient Rome, right? I would say that of all the states of the past of antiquity, ancient Rome has received the most attention, it's pretty much the driving force for the modern world. Just about every country, every nation, every society has something, whether they like it or not, from ancient Rome. Some aspect of their government or their society, their culture is derived from it. But with ancient Rome, it's estimated that less than 5% of all the literature, all of the written works survive, you know?
Whoa.
That number drops even lower when you think of the Greeks. I mean, most people think Greek statues are amazing, but the majority of our Greek statues and Greek artworks are Roman reproductions. You know, we have very few actual Greek statues still standing, still around. Most of them are copies from the Romans. And to their credit, the Romans became very good at copying those Greek statues. So we have accurate descriptions of accurate, I should say, reproductions of what those statues look like. But even with Greek literature, not much of it's more than, I would say, 99% of it it's gone. And with Egypt, for a society as long lived as Egypt, I would estimate that less than 1% of all their literature survives. We have fragments of many papyri, and I think even now, you know, when you look at it, Egypt, Narmer unified Egypt around 3100 BCE, and from that point on, I would say we have less than 100,000 pieces of papyri. You know, you're looking at a society that ran the gamut of 3,000 years, right? And we have less than 100,000 pieces of papyri, and most of those papyri are copies of the exact same thing. And it falls off even worse when we look at societies in, let's say, Babylon or the Hittites or Sumer and Akkad, right? We have very, very few documents from those people, from those societies. We have basically no paper or wooden artifacts from them. What we have are chipped fragments of like clay tablets, right? And they can give very, very good insight into their thoughts and their attitudes. We found in Egypt, in Kemet, a wonderful trove of mortuary papyri, mortuary records, and it gave us great insight into exactly how the people, how those two mortuary families conducted business, the services they provided to the local people. You know, most people will think that everybody got the type of mummification treatment that like a pharaoh got, and that's good when you're looking at the surface. But as an historian, you look at it and you say, well, Ramses the Great was a pretty egotistical guy. We call him the Great Chiseler. There's no way he's going to go through the same mummification treatment that Joe Blow went through. Let's further examine this. And well, and examining those mortuary records, we see that they had a sliding scale for the services they would provide for people. We see that that they divided the town between them, only two families. They didn't divide it saying that you take this part, you take these families, we'll take these families. They simply drew a line in the town. And if you died on the west side, we have you. If you died on the east side, they have you. They would to keep track of their customers. They will put toe tags on them. You know, like how we keep track of people in morgue with toe tags. They will put in the information that way. We found out just how long the process actually took. We found we don't know the full scale, the full rundown of how they prepared the bodies and stuff, but we gained a lot of insight into the time that it took and the methods and the products that they use to mummify. And going beyond that, I mean, there's one, and this is controversial too, because most people they draw a line when it comes to philosophy, and they say that with ancient societies, the only two societies that did philosophy were the Greeks and the Romans. But we have something from the Middle Kingdom of Kemet that to me just blows my mind, because it's philosophical and it's the earliest suicide prevention literature that we have. It's called The Argument Between a Man and His Soul. And it tells the story of a man who is just fed up with life and he wants to kill himself. And so he decided to do so. But right before he does so, his soul comes to him, speaks to him, and says, if you do this, I will abandon you in the afterlife. And the afterlife was a major concept for the Egyptians. You know, this they readily understood this life was temporary, and that the next life was going to be the good life. You know, they focused a lot of energy into making sure that they have the best life in the afterlife. And so the man says, no. We're going to have a good time in the afterlife. This life sucks. We're not going anywhere in this life. And his soul says, don't do it. I will abandon you. There is nothing you can say that will change my mind. And the man says, oh, I'll build you such a beautiful temple. I'll put the paintings on there. I'll put all our favorite foods in our temple. And he's going back and forth with his soul, having this argument about ending his life. And again, you know, the papyri is damaged, so we don't know exactly how the story ends. But it's an amazing, it's amazing just to understand the intellectual concept behind this argument, right? This philosophical argument, at least in my opinion, I believe it's an amazing philosophical argument of this man and his soul arguing over the merits of suicide. And there's another one that I want to bring up. It's oh, well, I don't want to get ramble on it.
No, you're good,
man.
You want to say? Yeah, well, I was just gonna ask you something that I thought of when you were talking about both of those. One is, do we know when, like, the first, not really funerals or like preservations of body, observing the body before its death happened? So basically funerals, and also when the earliest signs of us talking about afterlives came, and do those two have any correlation between each other?
Oh, well, we do know that it predates the rise of our ancient societies. I mean, Neanderthals cared for their sick and their wounded, and they buried their dead. So we have that. As far as an afterlife, we don't really have any means of testing for the concept of an afterlife. You know, I mean, early beliefs in gods and so forth, they predate any sort of writing, and none of that stuff was written down. We don't even, you know, none of that stuff was written down. It was never painted on caves or anything like that. I would go so far as to say that it predates any like organized religious thought or something like that. It probably arose from a natural longing to want to believe that, you know, your family or your friends is going to a better place and stuff, you know. But I mean, we have evidence of Neanderthals, and I mean, and Neanderthals lived a tough, brutal life. They had tools, but they would tackle their prey, right? So imagine you see a horse, and they hunted horses. They tackle horses and other large ungulates and even other, large feline species and so forth. But they will tackle them, and someone will come in with a spear or a sharpened knife, but they would have to actually do the physical work of grappling down prey. And you could imagine, doing all of that, you're going to receive injuries and so forth. And I mean, and again, this goes to just the development of our species and so forth, and the intellectual and the emotional attachment that our ancient human species, ancient humans and hominid species had. If a lion breaks his leg, he can't make it to the watering pool, so he's gonna die, right? If the elephant breaks his leg, the predators are gonna come and get him. He's not gonna make it. If an early hominid, if one of these Neanderthals broke his leg, somebody would either bring him water or take him to the watering hole. Somebody would bring him food, when he was hungry or stuff, or whenever they gathered food, they would put him in wherever they made their base camp, wherever they made their home, they would put him there, and he would, be taken care of. He would be given time to heal. We see these from their bones. We see very serious bone breaks, and these bone breaks would have ultimately led to their death, because of the infection and so forth. But we see that it would have that the person just didn't die immediately from that. That there were signs that the breaks were healing when this person died, which tells us that they were cared for after their injury. And we see some people with multiple breaks, that would tell us that they were injured, they healed. Sometime later, they were injured again, and they were taken care of to the point that they healed again. So we can see that sort of caring. But I mean, we see this very early on, that there was this let's call it a societal or a communal reaction to caring for the wounded and honoring the dead. But no clear indication on, when a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah. Do we know when we started, or humans started? You talked about breaks with the Neanderthals. Do you know when we started to put casts around and start healing those breaks, re-breaking, things like that?
I would say at some point in ancient Egypt, and it's amazing because we have a few medical papyri from Egypt. We don't have their full medical library, but we do know that and most of their work was trauma work and so forth. Because again, you're remembering that they're building those pyramids and so forth, and they're moving those 2.5 ton blocks of stone. So injuries are bound to happen. But we do know that they had the ability to make splints. That they frequently put people in splints. We do know that they figured out that what they would do, right, is that if you had a really bad break and you were bleeding and so forth, they will put a piece of raw meat there to further your clotting. What else? They and this is sort of just of a far one-off one, right? But there are certain women's health texts, right, that and it's really sort of strange, but they figured out how to make ancient birth control and ancient pregnancy test.
How did they do that?
They had a number of birth control methods. One was using dried crocodile dung. It creates this sort of alkaline environment in the woman and so forth that sort of blocks fertilization. Another would be that they would urinate on barley seeds, and whether it took or didn't take, they would figure out if somebody was pregnant or not. But they had these amazing sort of at least in that regards, very forward-thinking approach to birth control. Also pomegranates. They would also use pomegranate seeds. But it's amazing to think of their medical technology. And again, going back to the written records, and this is amazing. There's a cache of royal archive cache called the Amarna letters, and this was the diplomatic hub for the king Amenhotep III. and they dictate his communications with the other powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in one, it's funny. The Hittite king writes to Amenhotep III. He says, "Hey, my sister, she's having difficulty conceiving. Can you send a physician?" And it gives a little insight into the personal relationship between the two kings.
Mhm.
Amenhotep III says, "I know your sister. She's 80 if she's a day." Like just off the top making a joke, but he agrees to send a physician. We also get a little insight into how the later kings of the 18th dynasty in Egypt, the greatest of all Egyptian dynasties, how they managed their role as one of the great powers in the Near East, and it was gold. They would use the threat. They would one, pay off people to keep the peace and to keep their borders secure, but they would also use the threat of simply paying other people to make war on somebody to sort of keep their position in place. We also get from names, and this is something else that some historians really dive into. But the name of somebody, the name of a king, or the name of a prominent person in society dictates a lot about what that society was going through. So, for example, when we're looking at the kings of the 11th dynasty, this is the dynasty that unified Egypt after the first intermediate period, after a great chaos that brought down the monarchy and brought down society. Those kings have very interesting names. Names like Montuhotep. Now, Montu was a war god. He began as the personification of the desert sun, but Montuhotep basically means the war god is pleased. So if you're naming your kid the war god is pleased, it gives a nice insight into what that society is going through. The fact that they're probably fighting a lot of wars, there's chaos, and you want to curry favor. As opposed to naming your kid, let's say, Thothmosis or Amenhotep. Amenhotep means Amen is pleased, or it is pleasing or good to Amen. Amen being a variant of Amun, which is their chief god. They're basically saying that the chief god is pleased, everything is good. Or Thothmosis, Thoth being the god of writing and knowledge, Thoth is pleased. So where the great God is good, and the God of learning and wisdom is happy. So our society is flourishing. You can sort of see, just based off the names, the different attitudes of those two societies.
So it's almost impossible to talk about ancient Egypt without bringing up the pyramids. Is there any historical records that we think of now in the 21st century of how they built those damn things, and what the technology they were using to build the Sphinx, to build those humongous pyramids, and also why they did it? We know that a lot of it is around, it was for the gods, and also for the dead. It was for the pharaohs, right?
Yeah.
But why they did those, how they did it, is really what fascinates me.
It goes into the ancient burial customs of the Egyptians. So Egypt is basically an oasis. It's literally just about 20 miles east and west of the Nile River Valley. You have fertile plains, and beyond that, it's just harsh, unforgiving desert, very dry desert. And what the people would do, and this is going back, centuries before the pyramid had been built. It's probably going back around 45,000 BC. Not 45,000 BC, 4,500 BC. They would simply go into the desert, and they would simply they would dig these shallow graves and bury the dead inside these hot sand pits. And what would happen would be that the bodies would just dehydrate. However you place the body in there, the body would dehydrate. It wouldn't rot. It sort of fostered this belief in nothing ever changes. It really sort of it really had a major influence on their beliefs in the afterlife. But the body would hold the shape, It's also why the African golden wolf, what some people think is like a jackal, would become the image of Anubis. because these animals, they would simply wait for people to come out there and to dig the graves and so forth, and then they would simply go in and dig up and have at the cadavers. But the sand, whenever the sand blew away and these burials were uncovered, the people would see that the body looked the same. It would be no change. So that sort of like gave them the idea for mummification, but also it spurred in them an interest to create a better way to protect the dead, to protect the bodies of their loved ones and of themselves. So they started putting stone slabs. First, it was mud brick slabs over the burials, and these became known as mastabas. And has their society advanced and became more hierarchical, grander mastabas were created. Eventually, the first pyramid that we know of is called the Step Pyramid. Was created by a man named Dozier and its architect Imhotep, who would find fame himself as a doctor and become immortalized as a god. But Imhotep and Dozier had the great idea to create a grand mastaba. And what they did was they simply stacked them one on top of the other, with each successive tier being smaller and smaller and smaller. That sort of was the catalyst for pyramid building. That was the moment that the ancient Egyptians were taught how to build pyramids. We move on from him to the first true pyramids being built, and it's wonderful stories about historical lemons and architectural disasters with the pyramid of Maidum. They were moving towards creating good pyramids, but they were going off of Dozier's staff mastaba, and the man who taught the Egyptians how to build pyramids was a king called Sneferu. Now, Sneferu's first plan was to simply build a stacked mastaba, and then to fill in the sides. And it's called the Pyramid of Maidum, and it sort of looks like a medieval tower. It's this rectangular base that just goes up. It didn't have like the smooth sides that we think of as the pyramid today. His next attempt is called the Bent Pyramid, and it's amazing. You can't go in there; it's incredibly dangerous. But this was the pyramid when they realized that they had angled sides. This is the first one in Egypt that had angled sides. What they didn't do was clear the bedrock, so they built on the sand, and the sand shifts, so it became very uneasy, very unsteady, very late in the construction. They realized that everything was going to implode on itself. So what they had to do, they had to send off to Lebanon for Cedars of Lebanon, and inside the pyramid, still to this day, the only thing keeping the pyramid from collapsing on itself are these giant logs. And Google the Bent Pyramid after this, and it's just astounding to see that now, 4,000 years later, these logs are wedged between walls, and they're the only thing keeping everything from imploding on itself. But those are two architectural lemons. He finally got his act together, and it's amazing, right? We want to think that he's angry at his architect because the architect isn't doing the job right. We were probably thinking that there's some historical record or some lost. You're probably thinking that there's some lost papyri for him executing these architects for their misdeeds. No, these early kingdoms were family affairs. He's not going to execute the architect because the architect is his son, right? The son is being given all these, being given this responsibility, and you can imagine the conversation coming back. Yeah. Dad, it happened again. We got to try again. But they get their act together, and they make the first true pyramid in Kemet, and it's wonderful. They figured out that they had to clear all the way down to bedrock. They clear the bedrock. They build up they move in all these blocks and stuff, and we believe because we know the quarry sites that they use, and the quarry sites are all the way in Upper Kemet. They're deeper towards the African interior than let's say the marshes where the Mediterranean is. But they're quarrying down there. They're floating them down on rafts down to the Nile. And as far as like these the pyramid construction, there are a couple of different theories in place. One would be that they simply flooded the area because they also had these amazing hydro technology in which they would flood areas to create water reserves for their planting seasons, and then also to create like permanent aquatic gardens and stuff for the elites, for the wealthy elites. But there's a lot of speculation on if they would flood directly to their site, or if they would simply wet the sand and have again more cedar logs from Lebanon and simply pull the blocks on these cedar logs and so forth directly to the building site. If they would build up if they would simply pile sand high around creating these giant sand mounds basically around the pyramid site, and then simply clear all the sand away when everything was complete. But they finally got their act together. They cleared down the bedrock. They got all the blocks in place, and from there, a cultural competition was actually initiated between the kings of the fourth dynasty. You have to remember that pyramid building in Egypt was largely an old kingdom thing. It was something that began around it began around like the late 2000s BC, and it was done before 2500 BC. It was very, very quick. It was really literally just one dynasty, and that was it. It was literally just the fourth dynasty. But every one of those kings built a pyramid except for one, Shepshakaf. Shepshakaf, and we don't know if this was an indication that pyramid building was draining the kingdom's resources, but Shepshakaf, he doesn't build a pyramid. He goes back and he builds a mastaba.
Whoa.
He harkens back to the past, and archaizing would be something that would dominate ancient Egyptian society. It would be something that all the kings, especially a king who wasn't very popular, who didn't fight wars, or a new dynasty would do. They would always harken back to the past. But that's sort of like the pyramids, and from there you would have Khufu. Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest of the ancient Egyptian pyramids.
Pyramids.
Yeah.
All right, so now I want to ask you some questions since we've been talking about ancient history. I saw on your page that you studied American history, U.S. history, and that's something that fascinates me too, is because, just studying politics and stuff, you study like constitutional law and stuff like that. You study like basically the history of where we got our stuff. We get like Blackstone, we get like people from England, and then we find these ourselves, here. What's some interesting American history facts that interests you, fascinates you want to talk about?
Where to begin? It's so for example, the colonies, right? They all pretty much have these very interesting colonial legislatures history, right? But none of those legislatures were ever authorized by the British government. An interesting fact that always amuses me and always sort of like gives a what reaction from students is that whenever a colonial governor was sent out from England, he was advised not to give credence to the colonial subject. Do not engage with those legislatures. Those legislatures didn't have any authority. All authority was invested in the governors and no colonial governors. Now, the crux with that issue was that the British government would send out these governors, right, but wouldn't give them a salary. It wouldn't give them any money to oversee any sort of initiatives or policy programs that the government would have to institute. In order to raise funds for their own salaries or for their own policy initiatives, the governors would have to engage with those colonial legislatures. The colonies of Carolina, they were some sort of political experiment. The Lord Proprietors, the persons who were given the colonial charter by King Charles II, they had all these wonderful ideas on how to run a society. So they granted a constitution to their colonists, and it was filled with wonderful things. But ultimately, again, they weren't giving credence to colonial legislatures as well. They were appointing colonial governors. And another thing is that these colonies like Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, they were the personal property of those lord proprietors. So basically, every colonist who went there was a tenant. You know, it's like you own a million. But let's not say a million, but you own like 1,000 rental properties, and you want them rented out. You want people living there, but you don't want to hear their problems. You simply want them to pay their rent and pay their rent on time. It sort of was founded like that. Jamestown. Most people think that Plymouth was the first colony. It wasn't. Jamestown was the first permanent colony, but there was a colonial experiment before that at Roanoke. We don't know what happened at Roanoke. Roanoke is a genuine American mystery. The resupply effort at Roanoke was interrupted due to the Spanish Armada, the attempt to invade England and depose Elizabeth Tudor by Philip II of Spain. That interrupted any resupply missions, and when they finally did send a resupply to Roanoke, they found the settlement abandoned. Right? We do know that there was at least one child born there. We don't know what happened to them. The only thing there was only one thing written, and it was written on carved on a tree bark. It was Croatoan. Other than that, we don't know what happened to the people who settled at Roanoke.
What is Croatoan?
We don't know. We don't even know what that means. That's not an English word. Again, these are English colonists, and they carved in a word that has no place in English. It's not English. It doesn't translate to the local native peoples in North Carolina. It's just a mystery. Like they left. There's just one word that nobody knows, and they're gone. We to this day we have never found, and there have been investigations to figure out what happened to the people at Roanoke, but nobody knows. It is a genuine American mystery.
That's fascinating. It also is fascinating, like how long and how many people died just coming here alone. Those trips were so long, and if like for years, like people would go back to England and they wouldn't even know. They would leave their families in America and they wouldn't even know if they would ever see them again. There's so many stories of people who were like legislators, like you were saying, or people who were diplomats and stuff that had to go back and they were gone for 10 years. You never know what's going to happen to your family. I think there is some stories even from Roanoke that I've heard of people who left and then came back and everyone was gone and he was there.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and that actually has a long history where people simply, leaving an established life in America and going like either for like official government work. Like you think of John Adams. John Adams spent a lot of time in the 1780s away as a diplomat. He was he was an American ambassador to Great Britain, American ambassador to the Netherlands. And John Adams, first and foremost, he was a backcountry lawyer. He was a trained lawyer, but he also had a farm to run. And when he was away, the farm duties fell on his wife, and she had to oversee their farm for herself and for her children while he was away for years at a time. In official government roles, you think of who's another good example I can use for that. We can't say Jefferson, but Jefferson, of course, was in a completely different socioeconomic bracket. He left for years at a time. He was American ambassador in France. He got a firsthand look at the French Revolution and the chaos that erupted there as they began to challenge Louis the 16th right to rule. But even with him, he didn't know if he was if there would be some sort of epidemic and his slaves would die off, or if there would be some sort of epidemic and crops just wouldn't come in. So yeah, you can see that. And then also And then this is a very interesting feature, but there used to be migratory workers called birds of passage. And these people would book passage, right? And come over and help with seasonal work in the United States, like in New England. The apples are coming in, so these guys are going to book passage, come over, work for a season, pick at apple pickers and pressing apples to make cider, and afterwards they're going to go back. Or they will come in, get a factory job for a year or 5, and then leave and go back home. They will come over and just sort of be these seasonal or these long-term temporary workers, and then go back home. And it will be vice versa. If you left, you probably would make it the journey on over, but you don't know if everybody was going to be okay back home. Like if you left Norway to pick apples for a season in Maine, you didn't know what would happen in Maine, if you would get sick and die maybe far away from home, or if your family back in Norway would die and wouldn't make it.
We also have to assume that some of those people who got here and saw a new opportunity for their life would stay too, and like leave their old lives behind.
And just to highlight 2 areas, someone coming from Germany, wouldn't probably, because Germany between the 18, I want to focus this into like the 1880 to like 1910. Someone coming from Germany would probably just come for a bit, make some money, and then leave, right? But someone coming from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they would never go back. You have to remember that they wouldn't have, unless they were a middle-class German or Magyar, they had no voting rights. If you were a Slav, you had no voting rights. If you were Croatian, no voting rights. If you were Slovenian, no voting rights, no personal rights, no nothing. It was all dictated by the German and the Hungarian elites to you. You came to the United States, and you were automatically, you could pursue citizenship, okay, which means that you could get the franchise. You had there were educational opportunities. There was this sort of like the nascent beginnings of the public school system. So you had education opportunities for your kids. You would have been making more money than you ever would have imagined. And also your diet. One of the things that really astounded these immigrants coming from, like, let's say southern Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was your diet. You had access to foods that only wealthy people had access to back home, primarily meat. There was so much meat available, and we actually have like letters, caches of letters and stuff that people wrote about, dictating that. I don't know if you remember the movie Gangs of New York.
I do remember that movie, yeah.
There's a scene with these political bosses, and they're watching the immigrants come off of these ships. And you have some people who are very angry that the immigrants are coming in, these nativists and so forth. They're very angry about it. They have nothing better to do with their life. They hate on this. But you have these enterprising political bosses who are like, that's a vote, that's a vote, that's a vote. So the moment you came off that boat and so forth, somebody was trying to pull you in. And some cities, the people who stayed, who found this better life, some cities just became havens for them. You think of Boston in particular, and the Irish. Think of the famine, right? The British government the British government are pretty they were hands-on when it came to international economics and so forth, but they were pretty hands-off when it came to looking after the social welfare of people in the 1840s, 1850s, and so forth. They thought Catholic emancipation was good enough. The problem is solved. The famine hits and people are dying. Like there's no end. And the famine wasn't a one-season thing. It bled on for years. So you have this mass exodus out of Ireland. They're going to Canada. They're going to the United States. They're going to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They're just getting as far away from Ireland as possible. They're just trying to literally just find food and work. And Boston becomes a haven for them. The city population swells. They very much reshape the they very much reshaped the character of the city, you know, and it goes way beyond just, you know, the basketball team, Boston Celtics. I'm talking about like the flavor and the characteristics of the city. They find new political opportunities. They find new economic, industrial opportunities. The same thing with New York. There's another film, right? And it's called Far and Away. And it's one of my favorite historical films because it gives a pretty good example of what it would have been like. Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman star in the film. Tom Cruise plays this boy, this young man whose father dies, and he's looking at his life, and he's looking at being a tenant farmer on a wealthy landowner's estate, right? And the wealthy landowner, he owns the farms, he owns the local pub. He literally is the lord of the town. You know, everyone is in this sort of rural countryside area. And he said, this is not the life for me. I'm going to get away. So he books passage and he makes it to America. And he gains fame and wealth and a life that he never believed possible by first having a career as a boxer, right? He dresses in fancy clothing and so forth. He's dating, you know, he has a love interest and so forth. He's making it and so forth. He's a boxer, and he also becomes an enforcer for a local political boss. Things go bad. Things go bad for him there. He decides that he's going to head west. And again, the West was another opportunity. Heading west meant you get free farmland, you get free land. So they rush west, and this is coinciding with the Oklahoma. Because you know it's you probably heard of the term Oklahoma Sooners, right?
Yeah.
The Sooners and the Boomers. The Boomers were the people who came after statehood and got free land. The Sooners were the people who came before statehood and took the land. You know, so you have those two separate groups and like that. But he's coming as a boomer. He's coming as someone after Oklahoma had a statehood who's coming to gain free land, and it sort of reflects, you know, pretty accurately what that immigrant experience would have been like. You wouldn't have had just one shot at coming here and getting a factory job or making your way and so forth. There were multiple avenues available for that, and of course that's starkly contrasted with the situation in the American South, you know, where there was no ease of access for African Americans, and you were pretty much locked in to sharecropping. They very much denied those opportunities. They very stringently and forcefully denied those opportunities down there. And I mean, this is before even California was a destination. You know, this is people looking squarely at land in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, and so forth. People coming in to become homesteaders. And even with the homesteads, I mean, it's amazing photographs of when the people got there, they were literally just there. You know, Sears became big because Sears used to sell housing kits. These were houses, these were prepackaged materials that they would send out to you, and you could set up a house on the prairie or wherever you were at. And most of those houses are still standing. Like some of those houses in the Midwest, they're still standing. They're still going strong. But other people, if you couldn't afford a Sears house, what they ended up doing was they took clods of like this thick soil, and I mean, and this prairie soil had never been tilled before, so it's just compact and thick. You know, they will simply take thick slabs of this soil and make houses of it. And I mean, some of these houses are still standing from like Minnesota on down, of these prairie sod homes.
No, yeah, that's fascinating. And then you could always think about the Manifest Destiny, Lewis and Clark, and going to Oregon and everything like that, Oregon Trail. The Manifest Destiny with United States, that's like what the idea was formatted with, this American dream. There's always more. You know, you could always have more. We can always be better. And something I learned this last term taking constitutionalism is that, like, you know, we've always basically the whole entire time we've been striving to ensure this phrase in the preamble that all men are created equal, because for most time all men have not been created equal in America.
No.
But then you get to like it starts with Jefferson, and then you get to Abraham Lincoln, he takes those words and he starts the Gettysburg Address, and he starts the Republican Party and starts to franchise people. And then you get to Martin Luther King, who plays directly off of Abraham Lincoln, standing in front of his monument, you know. And it's this play on words that, you know, we stated something that's like the American dream, but it's never been accessed to everyone before. And so all throughout history, you get a testament of certain individuals trying to make it so, like, or making the people see a better future for everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, to go off of that, I mean, we go to Theodore Roosevelt, right? And Roosevelt, he's interesting in many aspects of American history, but he comes up with the whole deal aspect. You know, he comes up with the concept he called the square deal. And again, Roosevelt is looking at post-industrial America, right, where people transition from agriculturalism, and most people, most of us who aren't actively engaged in commercial farming or subsistence farming, we don't really understand the scheduling or the personal schedules or responsibilities of farming. And you're not out there 24/7 farming. Okay, when you're planting crops, you're very busy. It's all hands on deck. But once the crops have been sowed, it's pretty lax. You know, the animals basically take care of themselves. You just have to like feed them and make sure they have access to water and stuff, and that they're not sick or anything like that. But they go on. They keep on keeping on their own. And as long as there's no freak weather accident, the crops will do what they do. With industrial work, though, many of the people were just struck by how monotonous it was. It was a lot of workplace accidents and stuff that disfigured people. A book, if you haven't read it already, but it's a great book. If you do want to check it out, it's The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It gives a perfect look into what a meat packing plant was like and what the life of an industrial worker was like in Chicago around the turn of the 20th century. You came in from wherever you immigrated from, and you immediately got work. They put you in a plant, and they had people at every stage of the carcass preparation process. You know, you had knife men, men who wielded these knives like experts and so forth, carving up the meat and so forth, but it was dangerous, and there was no workers' compensation or anything like that, any sort of safety hazard protection, anything like that. So these guys would get injured, and it would be like, okay, get back to work. You can't get back to work. The door's over there. Bring in the next one. It was literally just a constant reshuffling of cards for these people. But Roosevelt comes out, and he puts in place, you know, anti-monopolistic laws to sort of break up, you know, the companies that had no competition, that treated their workers pretty shoddily and edged everybody else out of an industry. From Roosevelt, we go through to from Teddy Roosevelt, from Theodore Roosevelt, we go to Franklin Roosevelt, who comes up with the New Deal. And again, this again is more civic engagement policies that are designed to sort of ease the suffering of people and to sort of make the American dream more accessible to more people. And it's escaping me, but Truman had a deal and Lyndon Johnson had a deal. They all went back to this whole deal with the public to sort of be the cornerstone of their political agenda. And I mean, and just to like sort of backtrack a bit, yeah, you said that you're also studying like government. You're interested in like constitutional law and so forth. When I first got into teaching, right, one of the first things they had us do was to create a classroom management plan. And my plan was to create a class government, like a miniature class government. And my first policy, my first my first plan was to simply say, okay, we're going to have a class government, we're going to hold elections and make a class president, and I'm going to use that class president to, help me manage the class. And it was good. It checked all the boxes for what the assignment called for. But my instructor, he looked at it and says, okay, Ted, this is good, but how is this actually going to work? I mean, you don't just come up with something that looks good on paper. You're going to actually have to put this into practice. And the first thing, and I mean, and you get opportunity to put it into practice during your internships. And the assignment went well, but it fell flat on its face. First thing I learned was that you can't appoint anybody because that person's authority is going to be challenged, right? Yeah. And when you're structuring the activity for these kids, you wanna give them decisions and so forth. You want to let them come up with you want to structure it so that which decisions they're choosing, but you want to give them free range as far as if they're going to have a unicameral or bicameral legislature. Let them decide what they're going to call their chief executive. Let them decide what they're going to call the legislature. Let them choose how many legislators they're going to have. Let them decide what powers these legislators are going to have, and it actually blossomed into something pretty good. I've run through the exercise in public school and so forth, but there's differences between teaching in a public school system and then teaching with like homeschoolers and so forth. With homeschoolers, you can it's a bit more freeing. You can say, okay, well, if you guys want to tax yourselves, you can save your money and so forth, have a class party. With public school, you're gonna have to run that as like an after school club if you're gonna collect funds or anything like that, or have them collect funds on themselves. But the class government aspect of it is always interesting because at least in my experience, I found that with middle school age kids and so forth, they often don't develop party politics. Everything is factional. It's, I want to pursue this policy. Who's going to support me? It's never a long-term thing. What high schoolers, they're thinking, how do we control this? How do we keep this amongst us? Like, who can we bring in? Who can we satiate? Who can be brought in, have reliable votes and so forth, and reliable supporters of whatever we want to do.
The fascinating thing about that too is, like, one, you basically saw the foundations of popular sovereignty while you give people the voice, and two, you see that the more mature people in it tend to want to keep the power, while the people who are younger try to push the policies and like the things that help people. And you can see that even in American politics. You got people like AOC, who's just young House of representative who's pushing these policies for change, and then you get people like Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, who basically their whole agenda is keeping power within their parties. So it's fascinating that you saw it with kids, because it's the exact same foundation of what happens with people in government.
And I mean it's sometimes you have an enterprising middle schooler who thinks that far down, but for the most part, it's on an ad hoc basis for whatever crisis they think they're having. Whether it's determining rules for their House of Representatives, or determining if they're going to have like term limits or whatever and so forth, and they can be and it's I try not to directly influence them and so forth. I like to, because again, it's sort of like a social experiment. I like to see, just take a hands-off approach and let them just play through it and so forth. But instantly, whatever you discuss in a lesson, they're gonna take to like heart. I noticed with middle schoolers and so forth, they would contemplate term limits, and some would actually implement term limits so that everybody had access to it. And this was something that we discussed in Rome, where the Romans had like, they had like a 1 year, early in the Republic, they had like a 1 year term limit where you would stand for office, serve for a year, and then you're out of rotation for the next 2 or 3 years. And they started to implement the rotation in office so that everybody who wanted an opportunity to serve in the legislature would have that opportunity. the older kids and so forth, they would understand the concept of like secretaries and so forth. So they would, create cabinet level positions and so forth, and again, giving them the opportunity to choose who had like Secretary of State powers or Treasurer powers and so forth, just giving them that bit of like leeway and so forth, and letting them select their own persons and so forth. And for the most part, you would see the standard, somebody serving for a term or 2 terms and then out of office, and then somebody else comes in. This reshuffling of the deck in that sort of way. And also with the younger kids and so forth, if you just because you served as vice president didn't automatically mean that you will be a candidate for president and so forth. It was this random sort of like shuffling of the deck whenever they were electing a new president. Whereas again with the older kids and so forth, serving as vice president was almost a shoo-in for the presidency. You would almost sort of see a little course of offices that someone would have. Someone may start off as a member of their House of Representatives, maybe move on to their Senate, from the Senate gain a cabinet position, either like chancellor or prime minister, and then move on to vice president before being president.
Mm-hmm.
You will see this sort of ordered structure to these offices. How long they stayed in office was always up in the air. I have one kid. He was like, I don't know if you remember the show Boardwalk Empire.
I don't.
But it was a show about a bootlegger who was also a political boss in New Jersey, and the political boss kept everybody in office. He was not himself the main office holder. He was never the mayor of the town. He was simply the treasurer, but he held meetings and he decided who was going to get what office, and he played quote unquote the honest broker. He ensured that his 4 friends all got a chance to be president, while he himself stayed as the chancellor of the class. They had 4 cabinet level positions and so forth. 4 cabinet level positions. There was the president, the vice president, the chancellor, the prime minister, and the governor. These were their, and again, very unimaginative group. Those were all the choices for executive officer. So they simply took those titles and made them cabinet level positions. But he ensured all the friends rotated the president and amongst those other positions and so forth, to ensure that there wasn't any competition between them, and to ensure that his long-term class policies were implemented and never challenged. Ingenious kid.
Sounds like someone who fascinates me a lot. And obviously this is a kid, but the way that's kind of how it worked with Stalin in the Soviet Union. He was Grand Chancellor, and he had all his like buddies basically under him, but if they challenged him, so that's one thing. I don't know if you know anything about the Soviet Union, but that's one place in history that just absolutely fascinates me. The revolution.
It's one of history's great. It could have been great, and this is again, studying ancient states and so forth. You analyze where some states went wrong, and you say, wow, this state could have been great if they had made this adjustment. But again, and it wasn't like Stalin's his character flaws were known. Lenin famously spoke out against Stalin, and he highlighted his fears about Comrade Stalin. But again, it's he really fit in with his period. You have to remember that when Stalin is accumulating all the power and not leaving office and trying and not even trying, but just doing things that would have gone against the Soviet Constitution, you had Hitler doing that exact same thing in Germany. You had Mussolini doing that exact same thing in Italy. And interestingly enough, people put Franklin Roosevelt, in that position. When you look at Roosevelt in 1932, the presidency wasn't between what's good for the American people, it's what's going to happen to the American Republic, right? Roosevelt came in with ideas that even his supporters were like, whoa, wait a minute, the federal government had never done that before. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do this? I mean, because when you really analyze it, right, the big the three big pillars from Roosevelt's presidency are Social Security,
Yep.
which is an old age pension tax that workers agree to pay and collect, whenever if they live long enough to file or if they choose to file. Also, it would be what we now consider social welfare, which at the time, and it's still in some states, referred to as aid to families with dependent children, right? And the third one, and this is one that never really caught on, but it's the concept of packing the Supreme Court.
I was just about to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, a fourth one was his decision to run for more than 2 terms, but they corrected that with the constitutional amendment. But those were things that frightened people who looked at the American Republic. They were like, hey, guy, you had 2 terms, leave office, in 1936. And he's like, nope. And again, 1936 is a critical year because, again, this is where things start to heat up on the international scene. But he's running for another term. He's running for another term, saying that his work isn't done. He's contemplating packing the Supreme Court, and he's continuing to throw up New Deal policies that further evolve, and it's how you want to look at it. You can either say it led to the evolution of the American Republic, or it denigrated, it devalued the inherent spirit of the old American Republic. But Roosevelt is in that conversation as well.
All 4 of them, yeah. I haven't even thought about the comparison. You always can see the comparisons between Stalin and Hitler. Like, it's very, very, very apparent. But, and Mussolini to an extent. But adding Roosevelt or FDR into that category makes a lot of sense because of those 2 things. Specifically, what you said was packing the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was just validly like, no, that is not what we're doing. We're not going to add more seats because the 4 knights, remember? I don't know if you knew this, the 4 knights of the Supreme Court who just basically the old guys and Roosevelt.
Everything that he wanted to put in place, they struck down.
So we should explain for people who don't understand that, if you want to explain it. There were 4, if you want to explain it better than me, there was 4 Supreme Court justices who were older, and FDR knew that, and so he wanted, and everything he implemented, they just smacked down and called it unconstitutional.
Yeah. And they weren't wrong. I mean, they're the sickest hurt people, but they weren't wrong in challenging and saying that, hey, this is violating a certain constitutional protection that's been inherited in the system for since forever. And it wasn't as though it was any real animus against him or anything. They were just worried about the type of system that he was creating and so forth. And it wasn't all of his policies, but it was some policies it was some policies, some programs that they felt just weren't really going to benefit the nation, and this was more just power grabbing for Roosevelt. And Roosevelt eventually backed away. The only reason, and I want to mention this too, and I think we should highlight it, that the only reason Roosevelt backed away from court packing was because one of the justices started to die off and retire. So he was able to put his people on the court. But again, it was shocking. And then it was also Roosevelt's expert use of propaganda. You have to remember that during Roosevelt's presidency, Stalin was Uncle Joe.
Yeah.
You have to remember those fireside. And again, this is another sort of innovation, and this is a comparison that last year, well, not even last year, but the last 2 years, whenever I taught, I drew between Roosevelt and Trump. Trump's tweeting was the 21st century version of Roosevelt's fireside chats. Roosevelt would, and again, this is before, this is like in the early years, the early season of mass communication. Roosevelt understood that he didn't have to talk to reporters, he didn't have to talk to his political colleagues, he didn't have to do anything. He just had to make his appeal to the American public. And that's what he did. He hosted a presidential basically a podcast, a radio show in which he explained what he was doing, what his policy aim was, and what the benefit to the American people was going to be. Donald Trump tweeting did the exact same thing to his fans. The only difference being is that when you hear Roosevelt give those fireside chats, even on something that you didn't like, you're like, wow, this guy's he's really
Charisma.
clicking. Yeah, I mean, he knows what he is doing. He's expertly skilled in public propaganda, manipulating the public and getting them to buy in to a propaganda. But even going beyond that, we have to remember that it's under Roosevelt that Japanese internment occurs.
Yeah.
You know, and again, these are things that, and it's a great sorrow. It's a national tragedy, and it's something that we need to address. But again, it's something people they don't feel comfortable talking about, and they don't like to talk about. You know,
no, they don't.
It's always, you know, whenever you talk about Roosevelt, is stick to the New Deal and the fact that he overcame having polio. Never mentioned court packing. Never mentioned running for more terms than was constitutionally not constitutionally, but not like
I think you are right.
acceptable.
Yeah, so it was almost but it was a constitutional principle because of how influential George Washington was, and everybody followed that before FDR. You know, it was implicit in the Constitution that as a president, you wouldn't get too power hungry and you would only serve 2 terms, basically. Yeah. And you know, something fascinating that you brought up, the internment camps. Korematsu versus U.S. That Supreme Court case, dude. Nobody understands Korematsu. That. There's no precedent for that. There was no precedent for the. You were gonna say something?
Yeah, no. I was just gonna go on and say, yeah. I mean, well, and again, it sort of fit with this dynamic in the court, and with the court was just speaking on issues that nobody had ever really. I mean, well. The only correlation to it, right? There's only 2 other correlations to the court hitting this precedent like that, and that would be the Dred Scott decision, in which the Taney court ruled far, broad, and wide about the rights of African Americans in the old republic and so forth, and then also the Georgia case, the Cherokee case, in which the Marshall Court said that, you know, Georgia didn't have the right to seize Cherokee lands or to force them off the land, you know. But Gordon Karamasu's his case, it hit an error in federal judicial decisions and so forth that I still don't think. I think the only one that sort of come close to it would be the what was
Dred Scott?
No. In the modern era, the only one that comes close to it would be the gay marriage case. You know, that would be the only one where it's like this dire. I mean, because literally, the court
substantive due process.
Yeah, I mean, it's the court. I mean, the court really took a leap on that because again, we had federal legislation. I was going to say the Loving case, but there was never federal legislation against interracial marriage. It was mainly a state thing. But there was federal legislation against gay marriage, you know, the Defense of Marriage Act. And there was also federal policies within the military and within other aspects of the other departments in the federal government that, you know, didn't forbade homosexual relations or anything like that, but strictly regulated it. And then, you know, we have a Supreme Court decision that says, nope, none of that is applicable anymore.
That's basically what Scalia said in his dissent too. But, you know, you could also make the argument, 2 other arguments that, you know, so for those cases, Korematsu, it's basically violating human rights. And then you fast forward and you see also other substantive due process cases, which we find the reason that we find them okay and the Supreme Court has validated them is because of it adds human rights. So like Roe v. Wade is a big one. And before that, Griswold v. Connecticut, which was the contraception law before that.
Yeah.
And then you get Lawrence v. Texas, which basically was the precedent for Obergefell and gay marriage. And so, and even Brown v. Board to some extent, there wasn't any precedent, but we knew that those things were needed, and the Supreme Court basically saw with Brown v. Board, it was the Warren Court and then the Kennedy Court. I think it was the Kennedy Court with Roe v. Wade and Obergefell. Basically, or he at least wrote the opinions, but basically we were looking at something, and they didn't find any earlier precedent, but they said this is needed, and the right for for their own bodies, the right for people to express love in certain different ways, like you said, loving too, and then the right to and then the right for integrated schools. They were like, these are so valid and so necessary for American Constitution that it is constitutional, which is almost a backward interpretation, but we don't even think second about it unless you really read the way constitutional law is structured, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, we spent a lot of time on antiquity, but we could spend equally as much time on American constitutionality, and my whole approach to it, and it's something that whenever we begin U.S. history with a class, whenever I begin it with a class, is it evolves. There's an old principle from the British, right, in which the British do not write down any of their constitutional precedents. They believe in a living, breathing constitution. Things will change. We will change with it. New Zealand sort of take that approach as well, where the New Zealanders, they don't have a written constitution. They have a series of constitutional acts, just acts of legislature, and then also a treaty, the treaty between the British and the native peoples of New Zealand.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I cannot think of what their names are, though.
Yeah. That's gonna bug me, but the native peoples of New Zealand and the British government, they have a treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, and that sort of forms like the core of their constitutional outlook. It's sort of like with the Romans, where the Romans had a constitution. It was just never written down. It was just this series of intangible acts and precedents that dictated their behaviors. But with us and so forth, it's written documents, and they change. It's in their nature to change. It's in their nature for people to make them change.
Yeah.
And then also the amendment process as well. Like
Article 5.
I was just having a conversation with somebody who was up in arms, right, about women's rights and stuff not being taken seriously, and I was telling her about the ERA. Like, the ERA had been on the books since the 70s. And I was also telling her, and this is interesting, it's not just an American phenomenon, but it's a global phenomenon, to where the Equal Rights Amendment came within a hair's breadth of passing, and then Phyllis Schlafly appeared. And Phyllis Schlafly is like she is a feminist icon in one respect, because she was a woman who was educated in her own right, had a family, had kids, and left her family and her home to have this great public career. Unfortunately for the feminists, is that she had this her public career was pretty much on an anti-feminist arc.
Yeah.
She single-handedly campaigned to have the amendment killed and to reinforce what she felt was, the appropriate social position for women. But in the process of that, she became the model for every feminist, every woman who wants to have it all, who wants to have their career outside of the home and the family at home, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It struck me as odd and curious.
Well, something fascinating too about the 19th Amendment is, it gave husbands and wives, not really husbands, but wives, the ability to disagree with their husbands politically. Mm-hmm. Because before, you saw Abigail Adams was a very strong lady, but she didn't ever go against the politics of John Adams. But, in the modern era, we see Reagan's wife, we see what's her name, Hillary Clinton, we see Michelle Obama, we see strong women. Betty Ford, yeah, we see strong women having, not opposing, but having their own voice within politics. The role of the first lady becomes different. It becomes this almost voice for women. And now obviously we have Kamala Harris, who's the vice president, maybe running for president in 4 years. We don't know what's going to happen with Biden, but that will change it, change everything as well. But the 19th Amendment, when it came along, it really established the voice for women politically, because like we said, like how I said earlier, we were always striving for these words, all men are created equal. And the framers knew that they didn't want to put race in the inside of the Constitution, because they knew that one day some people would come along and it would evolve, like you said. But they did put the words men, because it was so, they could see a future where African Americans integrated with white men, but they could not see a world where women and men were the same politically equal,
Oh man. So the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, exactly what you just said. These were the early generation, the first the first feminist organization in the United States. They came together and they outlined exactly what you're talking about. They outlined the path to the 19th Amendment, to giving women its equal rights and so forth. They actually outlined the path for the ERA and the 19th Amendment. But those ladies, when the Civil Rights Amendment were being discussed and passed at the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War, they jumped up and they said, hey, and it caused great friction within, because they were also abolitionists, many of them, but it caused great friction within the old abolitionist community and the nascent feminist community, where they argued unsuccessfully that they shouldn't just give Black men the right to vote. They should be giving everybody included the right to vote. Let's put white women and Black women in there as well. And again, change is difficult, and it was enough of a hurdle to give Black men the right to vote, right? Springing it even on radical Republicans and so forth, the people who were desperately pushing,
like Lincoln and such.
Well, Lincoln wasn't a radical Republican. More of Thaddeus Stevens, the old time, the great, and I mean, we're all living in Thaddeus Stevens. His great vision for the Republican, which everybody's having these rights and so forth, but he and like Benjamin Franklin Butler, these guys are pushing it, right? But they're also gauging the more cagey Republicans in the Senate and in the House, and gauging local temperatures within the free states, and it was like almost a dead heat. With giving rights, voting rights, the suffrage to Black men, and to even mention white women or Black women getting the right to vote would have just been too much. It would have literally it would take another generation before that concept really caught on. And I mean, Wyoming is the first state to do so, but Wyoming does it about 30 years later, in the 1890s. Wyoming does that. But again, moving on from that to the very public role of like a first lady and so forth, we still find even through the 1920s and so forth that within the first 10 years of women having the right to vote, we don't really see very active first ladies, right? Eleanor Roosevelt really changes that. She was somebody who just and she and Franklin disagreed. Some of their disagreements were publicly known, but many of their disagreements were privately known and so forth. But, throughout Franklin's presidency and right until the end of her life, she took her political platform and she marched to the beat of her own drum. Like, she pursued them, pushed them. I mean, even going into like Beth Truman, Harry Truman's wife, she sort of played a backseat role. Harry Truman was, they had a very loving marriage and so forth, and she never really took a platform or a policy opposing him. As a matter of fact, Beth Truman, she went back to Missouri. She gave up on the whole Washington scene. She didn't like it, and it's funny anecdotes, right, about her writing the president letters. She couldn't bring her, and I mean, and this again goes back to old marriage and the dynamic within a married couple. She couldn't bring herself to ask for money on the phone, so she would write him letters saying that, oh, this happened, and they're saying this is how much it will cost. Never directly asking him for money and so forth, but just saying that there's a need for money. So people will be treated with this curious sight of the president of the United States going to Western Union to wire money back to Mrs. Truman.
Ms. Truman, yeah.
And even with like Mamie Eisenhower and so forth, right? We begin to see a more public role for the vice president, but really, and it was just a stroke of genius. And you have to give it to Jack Kennedy for being able to use his family in a way that FDR used the radio. Jacqueline Kennedy doing something as simple as remodeling the White House was a stroke of like just presidential propaganda genius, right? She came in and it was this young sort of glamorous lady and so forth, and she's speaking all soft like and so forth, and it really appealed to her generation. And then you contrast that, right, with Betty Ford just being, I mean, literally, you have to remember that Betty Ford was a Republican first lady, and she's talking about contraceptive rights. She's talking about alcoholism. I mean, like, you know, she's talking about her personal struggles. And you also have to remember that many people thought that her marriage to Gerald Ford would derail Gerald Ford's political career. You know, she was a divorced lady, and also with I'm forgetting Reagan's wife's name.
Nancy
Reagan. Nancy Reagan as well. Ronald and Nancy Reagan. They were both actors, right? Who, like, if you went back, like, it's a funny scene from Back to the Future where Marty McFly says
the
Ronald
actor?
Reagan is the president. Exactly. You know, it's who's an actor?
The Rock.
Exactly. You know, well, the
Yeah,
Rock already said
that's what
he
I'm
would be
saying.
president.
Who was?
I mean, like, you know, going back into Arnold, going back to 1980, Terminator came out, right? And
Yeah.
you say this guy can be governor of California one day, to hear people laugh at you, right? And even with The Rock and so forth, maybe The Rock does become president in what, 2032? 2032 or something like that, you know, give him a little time and stuff to wrap up those Fast and the Furious movies. But The Rock being president, that would be a great shock, especially for somebody who grew up watching him rock bottom people or at the Scorpion King or something, right?
Yeah.
But Reagan becomes president. You know, it's another testament to the evolution of the American political system, but also the evolution of like women's role in politics and the role of the first lady. I mean, whether you like their policies or not and so forth, they were able to connect and maintain that connection. One of the things that always struck me, right, was particularly with Nancy Reagan, was that she was always in the television shows. Like if you go back to TV shows in the 80s, the 80s in particular and so forth, but they always had a very special episode. And you would often see Nancy Reagan, particularly when they were talking about like hard issues like drug use or abuse or any sort of ilk like that. She would be there and she would be she would directly be speaking to the American people. We sort of see that we saw that sort of fall off with Barbara Bush, but people remember in the 90s, you know, Hillary Clinton vehemently pushing for healthcare reform during Bill Clinton's administration, and it's really a case study in and of itself to see how she sort of became a hated or loved figure because of her actions then and so forth. Some historians who covered it way better than I ever can, they've said that, you know, her attitudes, her initial moves, overtures to people really sort of like set the stage for how they viewed her when she made her run in 2008 and so forth.
Yeah.
You know? Or 2016.
Yeah.
And then you also contrast that with the role that Laura Bush played or Michelle Obama played and so forth in the national consciousness. I mean, you know, we can see that they both had their own their own like platform, their own policies and agendas and so forth that they pursued independent to what the president pursued, not in conflict or anything, but just their own role. And even now and so forth, I think there is an official office, an official executive office and so forth for the vice, for the first lady and so forth, and the second lady, to where they have staffers underneath them and they oversee various little policies and so forth. I mean, like people make jokes about it and so forth, and it really didn't live up to what it could have been. But Melania Trump, to be better, you know, if it had been like, you know, fully funded and like fully pushed and so forth, could have been something to really address, you know, the bullying culture we have now in the United States. But even that's like a milestone, right?
Yeah. You know, what you got out a little bit earlier about Stephen, Thaddeus Stevens. You know, I always thought it was interesting because we read the Stephen Douglas debates with Abraham Lincoln. We think Abraham Lincoln is this extreme progressive radical Republican, and he's like the man who pushed through the 13th, 14th, the 15th Amendment. You know, he was an abolitionist. And then you listen to the debates, or you read the debates, and Stephen Douglas is very clearly white supremacist, talking about how the white man is above the black man and everything. And Abraham Lincoln is saying, no, everyone deserves political rights. Everyone deserves civil rights. And then he goes into talking about, but I'm not for, you know, interconnectedness. I'm still for basically segregation, basically saying that whites are still supreme. And you read that and you're like, this is our progressive president, our progressive 16th president, this white supremacist.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing with Lincoln too, right, is Lincoln represents something that I think people are losing track of. Like, so it's easy to get canceled Lincoln on that, right, and not look at what Lincoln, what the Civil War taught Lincoln and what Lincoln wanted to do after the Civil War.
Yeah.
Like 1860, after November 1860, Lincoln was still that person from the Douglas debates. What changed was the events that unfolded between 1860 and 1865, between January 1st, 1861 and
April
11th, 1865, you know, just before his assassination. When Lincoln became president, he very clearly stated, look, I'm only going to, and again, this is a reflection of what the federal government, what we all thought were constitutionally permissible for the president and Congress to do. Lincoln said, the Constitution protects slavery. The state constitutions protect slavery. I cannot in any of, and there were 15 slave states, not just the 11 that went into Confederacy, but there were 15 of them. And Lincoln said, I can't touch it there. I can ask that you abolish it and free them and let them live good lives and so forth, but I can't force you to do it. What I can do is I can take action in the District of Columbia, of a federal territory. What I can do is I can bar it and outlaw it in the Western territories, you know, and that's what he said. And I mean, by that time, South Carolina was already gone. Georgia, Alabama, and Alabama was an interesting case as well, because when you get into the South, right, it's not all flat lands, particularly in Alabama. Most people think that Alabama is like Kansas or something, where it's just flat lands and it's good for agriculture. No, same thing with Tennessee. Tennessee is very rocky. Alabama very rocky, and there was a fierce argument in the Alabama state legislature over secession, and it barely passed. Alabama barely went in favor of secession. There were many people who, for one reason or another, were not economically invested in slavery, but they were socially invested in slavery, because slavery, of course, made all African Americans inferior to European Americans, due to the nature that European Americans could not be enslaved. So you were always, you know, at least a tier above. You know, it created this stratified hierarchy based on skin color. Tennessee was another thing. You know, people don't remember this, but Andrew Johnson was an unrepentant racist. He really forestalled all efforts at Reconstruction. He really tried to roll back every gain that African Americans gained during Reconstruction, but he was also deeply anti-slavery. He was deeply anti-slavery because where he came from, and he was a man with no former schooling. He was a former tailor who got fed up with seeing people in his community get ridden roughshod over by the wealthy slave owners and so forth, by people we call slavocrats. Those are people who had aristocratic tendencies and presented themselves as aristocrats due to their ownership of slaves and the wealth that their slaves made for them. And Lincoln took him on as vice president in 1864 because he was anti-slavery and because he remained in the United States, and he represented a segment of Southern slaveholding society that we don't really talk about. The people who were still racist but were anti-slavery, and that's a conversation in itself. But Lincoln, throughout the course of the war, Lincoln evolved his position. At first, he thought that he could solve the situation by simply removing all the African Americans. There was a plan to repatriate African Americans to Haiti. It's never talked about because it ended in dismal failure. It was called. They were sending them to Ile-a-Bac, Cowes Island. It's right off of Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and they sent 500 people down there, and the plan was to use this as a social experiment to say, hey, we can get them all transported out the country, and we can solve this issue once and for all. Again, a racist idea of creating a European American ethno state, but one that had good traction amongst policymakers. So Lincoln approves it. They send the people there, and they don't hear anything back from the man organizing everything. So a Union ship is sent to investigate. The guy was supposed to build schools, homes, hospitals. He was supposed to, set everything up for a successful society. He got the money, drops off from the face of history. We never hear anything back from this guy. The disease swept through there. Most of the people died. More than 3/4 of the original settlers died there. Less than 200 make it back to the United States. That idea firmly squashed. And this is before the Emancipation Proclamations come in. And so now Lincoln is thinking, we can't send them out. That plan just backfired in my face. Let's talk about forcing them to end this war and negotiate some sort of emancipation. So he issued a preliminary emancipation proclamation. And this is before, this was issued in late 1862. And he says, hey, surrender now, you can keep your slaves, and slavery is forever barred from the territories. He's making this appeal to people in the Confederate leadership. But this is 1862. The Confederates are on a hot streak. They're winning the battles, and Robert E. Lee is planning his first invasion of the free states. He's planning to invade. He can't go to Washington because Washington's the most heavily defended place on the planet at this point. But he can strike into Maryland, Pennsylvania,
Virginia.
He was branching out of Virginia. They were attacking him in Virginia. But he can attack Pennsylvania and Maryland, and from there, you can rip up Ohio, or you can rip up New York. It'll be his option, but he had to take Pennsylvania. No one listened to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So then the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, but again, neither of these really hold any water because there were 15 slave states. 11 go with the Confederacy. 4 stayed in the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware all stay in the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation freed none of the slaves living in those 4 slave states. It freed the slaves of active participants in the rebellion. So you could be in Georgia, be a slave owner, support the Confederacy, and when the Union Army showed up, said, hey, I don't know those guys. I told them not to do it. I'm pro-Lincoln. I love me some Abe. You could say all of that and still keep your slaves, under the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that situation never developed because the Union armies hadn't penetrated into Georgia at that point. They were still being rebuffed in Virginia. Robert E. Lee was still racking up victories there. Ulysses S. Grant hadn't risen to prominence in the Western theater of the war. So none of these slaves are potentially free by any of that. You ratchet on beyond that to the point that Lincoln, he becomes great friends with Frederick Douglass, and he and Douglass had this idea of recruiting African Americans to actively fight in the war. Lincoln goes along with it. He helps push the idea. This is where you get units like the 54th Massachusetts, coming into play. Lincoln's push and his approval of it and so forth. So you begin to see Lincoln sort of move away from this. There's no equality. They can't do the things we do, to now he's arming Black soldiers, and he's floating the idea that Black soldiers after the war be given the right to vote, because they're living up to the ideas of citizenship, in which they're embracing our principles of freedom and so forth, and they're fighting for us in this war. Okay, we move on from that to the problem of like contraband slaves, in which slaves in slave communities, they were reticent to move without any real assurances or protections. Whenever the Union Army showed up, slaves flocked to them. They abandoned the plantation. They understood that the Union Army meant freedom. It meant freedom from the lash, freedom from all sorts of servitude and so forth. Congress passed an act freeing all contraband slaves, right? What's his name? Sherman. Sherman is beginning his march into the South, trying to break up the industrial capabilities of the South, restricting all their access, all of their ability to send the agricultural goods or even the manufactured goods. But he can't move because he has this large camp of former slaves or runaway slaves with him. Sherman comes up with the idea of this: I'm going to give you 40 acres and a mule. This is where it comes from. Sherman issued a field order saying that he would give that to those people. And Sherman was another person who disagreed with slavery, but he was pretty racist himself. And it's always surprising for historians that Sherman did that 40 acres and a mule comes from William Sherman. But Sherman does it. And Lincoln interferes with it, but he doesn't publicly say anything against it. And slowly, the idea that giving the former slaves some sort of access to land to support themselves will be a good thing. It will be a good way to protect them from falling back into the abuses of the old slavocrats and so forth. Now, the crux of all this really comes into the issue with Reconstruction, and Lincoln's plan with this to quickly get those southern states admitted and then start to pursue the policies. Lincoln wanted 10%, and it's called the 10% plan, but he wanted 10% of the voting population of these 1860 states, of these states, to vote and approve a constitution abolishing slavery and accepting, the fact that African Americans were now free and will be given some sort of civil rights. Congress disagreed with that. Congress, and at this point, Congress was controlled by the radical Republicans, and they were out for blood. The free states were out for blood. They had endured many setbacks, militarily, financial, economic, and they've been embarrassed on the world stage. You win a war, you want to punish the losers and so forth. They wanted a Carthaginian peace from the Confederates. Lincoln understood that, that it couldn't really happen, and that the best thing for everybody was for them to agree to this now, and for us to settle all of these social issues as quickly and as quietly as possible. Lincoln's assassination ended its involvement in Reconstruction, but Congress would eventually go with its 10% plan. All their other like harsh measures would fail. They would go with its 10% plan, and we can only speculate on what would have happened between 1865 and 1868. But we see Lincoln moving drastically to the left of his positions on slavery and race and the future role of African Americans in the Republic. We don't know how far left he would have gone. He was above all things a pragmatist, but he had come, I would say, a long way. Not I don't think that he would have been in favor of something like loving or anything like that, but definitely the citizenship and the vote would have been things that he that he would have supported. You know, he oversaw the 13th Amendment's passage, but he died just after the 14th and then the 15th were being contemplated.
Well, man, we're almost 2 hours into this. Thank you so much.
Wow.
I think that's a good way to end it.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun talking to you, man. I learned a lot, and it was always engaging the entire time. So thank you for coming on, man. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, no problem. Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, man.